Welcome back to the deep dive. Get ready, because today we're really going to challenge some fundamental ideas.
We are. We're diving into excerpts from The Myth of Normal, Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. It's by Gabor Mate with his son, Daniel Mate.
And we're looking closely at sections of this, well, really expansive work.
It really is. It pulls from Gabor Mate's decades as a physician, working across the board from birthing centers to palliative care, and it brings together a huge amount of research: medicine, psychology, social science.
So our mission here today is to pull out the most crucial insights from these sources.
Yeah, we want to get right to the core of the book's argument.
Which is this pretty challenging idea, like, what if what our society calls normal is actually making us sick and unhappy?
You're not just mentally, but physically too. How this toxic culture, as the book calls it, gets under our skin. And then, importantly, what the book suggests about paths to healing.
It's definitely not just looking at individual problems.
No, it explicitly connects our personal health to these huge systemic things: the economy, inequality, even how we raise our kids.
Okay, let's jump right in then. The book really starts by questioning our basic assumptions about health.
It asks that big question: what if normal in our culture isn't actually healthy?
And how does it define this toxic culture? It sounds broad.
It is broad. It's not like a list of specific bad habits. It's the whole context. The sort of air we breathe,
Yeah.
the social structures, the beliefs, the values that just permeate everything.
Okay. And it presents evidence that this context is toxic.
It does. It points to things like the really high rates of chronic illness.
Yeah.
Like in the U.S., something like 60% of adults have at least one chronic condition, and 40% have two or more.
Wow. That's a lot.
It is. And add to that how many people are on prescription drugs. Nearly 70% of Americans on at least one, over half on two.
And it's not just a U.S. thing.
No, the book mentions rising obesity globally. Mexico, China are examples given. Plus, increasing rates of autoimmune diseases, especially hitting women hard, and, worryingly, some cancers appearing more in younger people, even non-smokers.
So it's connecting these health stats directly to the cultural environment.
Directly. It names things like chronic stress, inequality, and this deep sense of disconnection as major factors. The argument is that the global economic system, what it calls a total commercial environment, isn't just messing with our minds, it's actually impacting our bodies, our physiology.
That constant stress response being triggered.
Exactly. Whether it's subtle or obvious, the idea is that this chronic stress is a key link to these rising physical and mental health issues.
All right, let's shift to what feels like the real cornerstone of the book's argument, trauma. But it uses the word differently than maybe we're used to.
It really does. It's not only about those big, obvious, terrible events like, capital T trauma like abuse or neglect or major loss.
Although those are included.
Of course. But the core idea here is trauma as the injury that happens inside the person as a result of those events, or sometimes the result of not getting what you needed emotionally.
Okay, so it's an internal wound.
Yes, a wound to the self, a sense of not being safe or worthy that gets lodged in your nervous system, your mind, your body.
The author shares a personal story about this that really illustrates it, reacting with intense rage to his wife just texting that she'd be late picking him up.
Right, after a successful trip. And he connects that seemingly huge overreaction back to his own infancy, being separated from his mother during the Holocaust. It links to John Bowlby's work on attachment, how infants defensively detach to protect themselves from the pain of abandonment.
Survival strategy.
A survival strategy that gets wired in. So later in life, even small triggers, like that text message, can set off that old, deep-seated pain and fear leading to these big reactions.
That makes sense. And it connects to that quote from Tara Westover's book, Educated.
That it's not affecting me. That was its effect.
Yes, that really captures it.
It perfectly shows the cost of suppression, right? Building that shell, appearing unbreakable, doesn't mean the trauma didn't happen. It means the strategy of shutting down feelings was adopted so deeply for protection. But that comes at a cost. It can hollow you out.
And the book also touches on trauma being passed down through generations.
Multi-generational trauma. It mentions Mark Willand's work, suggesting these unresolved issues aren't just psychological stories we inherit, but might even impact how our genes function through epigenetics.
So the bottom line here is that trauma, define this broadly as internal injury and disconnection.
Is seen as a major block to flourishing and a significant contributor, maybe even an antecedent, to all kinds of illness, physical and mental. It drives inflammation, keeps the body's stress systems firing, hinders healthy gene expression.
Which completely challenges that old idea of the mind and body being separate entities.
Absolutely. The book argues powerfully for their unity, showing how chronic stress and emotions we might push down actually show up in our physical health.
And it uses some really stark examples.
It does. Like linking suppressed anger to reduced effectiveness of natural killer cells, those immune cells that fight cancer. It notes that nurses have often observed this connection anecdotally, seeing people who are maybe too nice, suppressing anger, potentially having higher cancer rates.
And that comment from the neurologist about ALS patients often being extraordinarily nice.
Yeah.
That's quite chilling.
It's a correlation that really makes you think. Or the research linking unresolved grief, especially in bereaved parents, to certain blood cancers. And a Harvard study connecting PTSD to higher ovarian cancer risk. But, and this is key,
Yes.
remission of the PTSD symptoms was linked to a lower risk, which suggests healing the emotional trauma can actually impact the physical disease.
That's huge. It makes that idea of interpersonal biology feel very concrete. You know, phrases like weak in the knees or shot through the heart.
They're not just metaphors. Our relationships physically affect us, and the quality matters. Marriage might offer health benefits, but the book points out it's uneven, sometimes more for men. And, crucially, being unhappily married can be worse for well-being than being unmarried.
So it's the quality of connection.
Exactly. And this isn't just about partners. It extends to our place in society. Social status, job security, these things impact our biology. Unemployment linked to inflammation, lower rank in the civil service linked to higher heart disease mortality.
There's even that provocative line, a bad job is worse for mental health than being out of work.
It raises fundamental questions about how much our social world shapes our physical selves, which leads us to epigenetics.
Right. Explain that again simply.
Okay, so it's not about changing your fundamental DNA code. It's about how your experiences and your environment influence which parts of that code get switched on or off, like dimmer switches for your genes.
So experience tells your genes how to behave.
In a way, yes, without rewriting the basic blueprint.
And the example of racism's impact here is, well, it's staggering.
It is. Higher inflammation in African Americans. And the source cites research suggesting racism and discrimination account for more than half the difference in how certain immune-related genes are working. Dr. April Thames' work is mentioned.
It shows how social injustice literally gets embedded in our biology.
Precisely. And this is where the book criticizes mainstream medicine sometimes. It says specialists, like rheumatologists dealing with autoimmune diseases, see these links between stress, trauma, and conditions like RA or MS,
But they feel they can't really talk about it.
or they feel unsupported like renegades because the system is so focused on the biological pathology, often ignoring the psychosocial context.
It mentions someone called Soma Weiss pointing this out way back in 1939.
Yeah, in JAMA, saying social and psychic factors were dominant in many diseases. And the book notes the irony that even at places like Harvard, where he worked, this integrated view still isn't fully standard practice.
Which leads to suggesting we reframe illness itself.
Maybe see it less as just an entity or a fixed state and more as a process. Potentially even, as one person B shared in the book, a teacher that can lead to profound transformation.
Which brings us to how this culture shapes us right from the beginning. Parenting and human development.
Yeah, this is foundational in the book. It stresses that humans aren't rigidly pre-programmed. Our experiences are crucial. It quotes scientists saying, "We're genetically determined not to be genetically determined."
Meaning our development is open to influence.
Hugely. And it's the early emotional interactions with caregivers, the attunement, the connection, that are the primary architects of the brain and mind, more so than, say, intellectual stimulation alone.
So ideally, kids need caregivers who are consistently present, attuned, and not overly stressed.
That's the ideal. But the book argues that the pressures of our modern culture, economic stress, isolation, unrealistic expectations, make that incredibly hard for parents.
So it's not about blaming parents.
Absolutely not. It's very clear parents are also products of and under pressure from this culture. Blaming them misses the systemic picture entirely.
And this impact starts incredibly early.
Even before birth. Maternal stress, trauma, even the father's chronic stress impacting the mother, these can have epigenetic effects on the developing baby, affecting things like placental function, setting health trajectories from day one.
The book contrasts traditional childbirth ways with some modern medical practices.
Yeah, it highlights how traditional approaches often centered intuition, body wisdom, strong support, versus a system that can sometimes become Overly mechanistic, strict induction protocols based on age alone, treating labor like an illness. Courtney's story, feeling pressured and bullied by her doctor just for being over 35.
Right. Ilana Stanger-Ross is quoted on needing to see the person in labor as a whole human undergoing something profound.
And this critique extends to parenting advice too. Yes. It questions advice that prioritizes, say, parental convenience or strict schedules over a baby's core needs for connection and responsiveness. Cites examples like some interpretations of crib sheet or approaches focused on conformity through intimidation like Jordan Peterson's.
Saying these reflect cultural values, not necessarily developmental science.
Exactly. Contrasting it with wisdom traditions that prioritize the child's need for secure attachment above all, it misses that nursing couple idea. The parent-child unit has mutual needs, but the child's needs for security are paramount early on. And stress just makes parenting feel less rewarding, more like a burden.
It tackles the very sensitive topic of infant crying.
It does. Arguing forcefully that ignoring infant cries, often part of sleep training, stresses the baby's developing brain and also goes against the mother's biology, causing her stress too. The author mentions the backlash to an article on this.
Thinking I rest my case.
Yeah. It shows how deeply embedded cultural ideas can clash with our biology.
And it talks about parents being there physically but not emotionally.
Proximate separation. Being distracted, stressed, emotional, checked out. Kids pick up on that lack of full presence. The unconscious message can become, I'm not worthy of attention unless I earn it. These early feelings about self-worth stick around.
Which can lead kids to look elsewhere for connection.
To their peers. Peer orientation. If the parental attachment feels insecure, kids might desperately seek belonging and validation from friends. But this often involves suppressing vulnerability, hiding their true selves, which increases risks for anxiety, depression, bullying later on. Cites Natalie Angier, WHO Stats.
Because vulnerability is needed for growth.
Absolutely. The book says becoming invulnerable is like a cage, and it raises alarms about digital devices here too, compulsive use by everyone, tech exploiting our dopamine systems, further disrupting real connection.
Okay, let's shift slightly. The book challenges how we think about mental illness.
Yeah, it questions the term itself. Arguing it often puts too much focus just on brain chemistry, making it seem purely like a medical issue,
Which can limit understanding.
and potentially make the person feel passive, like they have no power. It notes that psychiatry's hope of becoming an exact science, like mapping genes for everything, hasn't quite panned out.
Why is the genetic explanation so appealing then?
Well, the book suggests it's simpler. It seems to remove blame from the person, from parents, from society. It's easier than grappling with complex life histories and social factors.
But it insists the rise in diagnoses is real.
Yes, not just better detection. It sees it as a genuine consequence of the toxic culture's impact on development and well-being.
So even without obvious abuse, emotional injury has biological effects.
Definitely. Bruce Perry is quoted saying relational history is often the strongest predictor of how someone functions.
I found the idea of the mind as a meaning-making machine really helpful.
Right. It creates stories, even ones that look like delusions from the outside, to try and make sense of overwhelming feelings or experiences. Dr. Hunter's story about her fantasies making emotional sense in light of her past.
It suggests healing involves understanding that internal logic.
Exactly. Seeing the coherence behind the symptoms, not just trying to stamp them out.
So seemingly chaotic behaviors, self-harm, eating disorders, addiction,
Are reframed as coping mechanisms, adaptations, attempts to regulate a dysregulated nervous system, or numb unbearable pain, or grasp some control. Think Leslie hitting herself to calm down, Andrea's anorexia for control, Robin Williams' loneliness, the Chef family story linking addiction to relationship issues.
constant activity, hypervigilance.
All potentially defenses, natural responses to unnatural circumstances, as the book puts it, built often unconsciously to survive.
And that point about childhood self-blame.
It's heartbreaking but makes a grim kind of sense. Believing I'm bad gives a child a sense of agency. Maybe I can fix myself and earn love, which feels safer than accepting that the world or their caregivers are unsafe. Helen Knott's story is referenced.
Okay, broadening out again, the book argues these personal wounds are tied into larger societal systems.
Definitely. There's a significant critique of capitalism and global materialism. Not that the system is failing, but that it's succeeding for some by driving inequality, devaluing community, and eroding deeper human values. Quotes Stiglitz, Krugman, Nader.
And corporate wrongdoing isn't just isolated incidents.
It's presented as systemic, faithful to the logic of profit above all else. Mentions Purdue, pharma, and opioids, tobacco targeting vulnerable groups, the massive health costs of processed foods and sugary drinks, coca colonization, millions of deaths globally linked to diet.
And the specific toll of racism is emphasized again.
As biologically embedded. Structural violence creating huge health disparities, COVID rates, cancer risks. James Baldwin is quoted on the cost of suppressing black rage. Carlene's residential school story is a powerful example of this systemic trauma.
It brings back that Virchow quote about medicine being social science, politics being medicine on a large scale.
And mentions Michael Marmot's work on social determinants. Showing this link between society and health isn't new, but still faces resistance.
It also specifically discusses the stresses on women in a patriarchal society.
Linking higher rates of chronic illness and mental health issues in women to these cumulative stresses that get under the skin, affecting immunity. Examples like women's extra care burden after heart surgery, or Ray Mattei on mother rage from impossible demands.
The analysis touches on politics, too.
Arguing that wounded people sometimes elect wounded leaders, leading to policies that reinforce trauma. It offers interpretations of public figure struggles through this lens of developmental history and self-suppression.
And this all ties back to a loss of connection.
Yes, this idea that global materialism drains genuine connection, leading to breakdown. Bruce Alexander's concept of dislocation, losing touch with self-others, meaning described as deeply painful, like a joint being pulled apart, affecting whole groups, indigenous peoples, areas hit by deaths of despair.
But after all this heavy analysis, the book does offer hope. It talks about healing.
Absolutely. It pivots strongly towards pathways to wholeness, and interestingly, it includes activism as one potential path, channeling that energy, like Nan Golden fighting Purdue or Greta Thunberg speaking out. Young people showing what the culture ignores.
So what are the core paths to healing it outlines?
A major one is transformation of identity. Recognizing and gently letting go of those adaptive traits, the people-pleasing, the hyper-responsibility that helped you survive, but now limits you. Like shedding a second skin.
And illness can sometimes trigger this.
Yes, stories from people like V, Donna Zmanak, Erica Harris, Cheryl Canfield show how facing mortality led them to question everything and live more authentically. That idea, dying well is living well, accepting death frees you to truly live.
Authenticity is key then.
Hugely. Noticing where you're not authentic, gently questioning the beliefs that keep you stuck, finding agency real choice instead of just reacting based on old patterns, renegotiating your relationship with those adaptive strategies.
And what about anger?
Reintegrating healthy anger, not chronic resentment, but anger as a necessary boundary protector. Panksepp's rage system, situational, protective. Acceptance is crucial too. Accepting things as they are, including the difficult feelings, anger, sadness, confusion, seeing them as attempts to avoid deeper pain. Healthy grief is often part of this Gordon Neufeld's ocean of tears.
Compassion is mentioned.
Both for others, that compassion of recognition, seeing yourself in others' struggles like Bruce the surgeon's story, and crucially, self-compassion, treating yourself like you treat a suffering friend.
And listening to your body.
Yes. Symptoms as signals. Messages that you strayed from your core needs or suppressed parts of yourself. Inquiring into symptoms like an internal family systems, IFS, can reveal what needs expression. An RA study is mentioned where this seemed helpful.
It all seems to come back to connection.
Reconnection. If trauma is broken connection, healing is reconnection to your body, your vitality, reality, other people. And you don't always need explicit memories. Working with the present moment, the body's sensations, like Peter Levine teaches, can be profound.
And it mentions spirituality.
Touching spirit. Through things like mindfulness, nature connection, Ashley Judd's Creek experience indigenous wisdom. And potentially carefully guided psychedelic work like ayahuasca for shifting perspective, connecting to something larger, fostering compassion. It requires surrender.
And as we said, collective action, activism can also be healing.
It's a really holistic view. Acknowledging the deep hurts and the systems involved, but insisting that reclaiming wholeness is absolutely possible.
So wrapping up this deep dive into excerpts from The Myth of Normal, we've seen this powerful argument that what society calls normal can actually be toxic.
Yeah, contributing to illness, distress, disconnection, rooted in culture, stress, trauma, personal and collective.
But crucially, we've also explored the pathways the book offers towards healing.
Paths grounded in self-awareness, acceptance, authenticity, connection, and listening to our own bodies.
So this offers you, the listener, a different kind of framework. If you feel stressed or disconnected or unwell, even when things look normal on the outside.
The book suggests It might not just be a personal failing or a simple biological glitch. It could be an adaptation, a natural response to unnatural or difficult circumstances, past or present, personal or societal.
These are definitely challenging ideas. They push against a lot of standard thinking.
But they're supported, as the source shows, by a lot of research and clinical experience. They offer this integrated way of looking at our well-being.
And the source material really highlights those adaptive traits that seem good, being helpful, nice, pleasing others.
But when they become compulsive, automatic, they take a huge toll on our health and our true selves. The book constantly encourages self-inquiry around these patterns.
Exactly. It pushes us to look inward at the scripts we might be living out without realizing it.
So let's leave you with this question, drawn from the spirit of the source material. What are you saying yes to in your life, when deep down maybe a quiet no wants to be heard? What adaptive traits, ones that might have served you well in the past, could now be holding you back from living your fullest, most authentic life?